Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Executive Director at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. My pleasure to welcome you to the first of our series of monthly Lunch and Learn presentations. Here we are in February. We'll do these the last Friday of every month through the rest of 2022 up till November. And this is our first for the year. Typically, we have a staff member and or a guest speaker, and often a panel approach to these presentations and touching on important issues that affect Maine's working waterfront and commercial fisheries. And today's topic certainly fits into that. It's a snowy day here. We've closed our office this afternoon and we're all coming to you from our respective homes. Those of us that are from the MCCF staff. I'm going to hand it over to Carla and let her introduce our panelists, who I think are also coming from their homes. I hope you're safe and warm where you are. Beg your indulgence with the bandwidth. Hopefully we'll get through everything here today, but many of you, if you've been using Zoom and online platforms, you know sometimes we can have difficulty with bandwidth, but hopefully things will go well. And so far things look good. I'll just do a prelude to the next Lunch and Learn will be March 25th, and we're working on organizing a session that will be about the offshore wind energy roadmap process that's happening right now. So with that, I'm going to step away and try to disappear, and I'll pass it over to Carla.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the folks who are tuning in, joining us for this talk. I'll introduce our panelists. We are a project team who's been working together for a little over a year now on developing social indicators for the lobster fishery. We are myself, the chief scientist at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, Josh Stoll, assistant professor at University of Maine. We are Theresa Burnham, who is joining us actually from California. She's a postdoc who's working at the University of Maine from California. I'll introduce Joelle. She's a master's student as well, who's kind of behind the scenes, helping us out with a lot of this work. And Kathleen Reardon, who's the state lobster biologist at the Department of Marine Resources. And Kathleen Billings, who is the town manager from here in Stonington. Kathleen join us as kind of recipients of this information, users of the information. And we're a broad research collaborative. This project team also includes the MLA and other folks that are on our title slide that are also in the audience, including we're funded by Maine Sea Grant, by National Sea Grant, Maine Sea Grant, Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions, and I think the list might even go on from there. So I just wanted to kick this off really quickly. The context for this research is essentially that we have a really robust biological monitoring system for lobster here in Maine. So robust that many of the other states that share the resource have followed up on our lead in some cases. And we monitor lobster at the various life stages so that we can get an early indicator of how the population is doing. We were thinking after we kind of blew the top off of any knowledgeable person's expectations of what the lobster population could do here in Maine, we kind of blew the top off of that back in 2010 and 12, and we kept going. So to 2016 and beyond. So we realized, okay, if this is what the lobster population can do, and we're seeing this, we've kind of come to a point where we are becoming socioeconomically dependent on lobster being at the top of its bubble, at its greatest point that we've ever seen in history. So let's try to also understand and create indicators of how we've become socioeconomically, socioculturally dependent on lobster being at this point. And this is kind of a real first attempt beyond just looking at fishing effort, licenses, and landings and value to try to assess how the fishery, how the social and economic part of the fishery is doing. So without further ado, I will present or turn the stage over to Theresa. who will give us a quick presentation of this is work in progress. So she's going to present one of our first indicators and how we've arrived to that place. And then we will move into a panel discussion session with Kathleen responding to the data as we've presented it. And then we'll go into Q&As.
Great, thank you, Carla. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, is everyone seeing my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much for that intro. I really appreciate it. And hello to everyone else that's on the call that I can't see. I want to start by recognizing those funding sources and partners that Carla mentioned. Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries obviously is a really important partner in this work, as is the Maine Lobstermen's Association and the Maine Department of Marine Resources. And so far, our project has been funded by the National Marine Fisheries Service, National Sea Grant, and the George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. And it's been really thrilling to work with and be supported by all of these organizations on the project I'm going to be presenting today, which is developing social indicators of resilience in Maine's lobster fishery. Our goal with this talk is to provide some background about the project, describe the progress so far, explore one of our candidate indicators, and then open it up to comments, questions, and the panel, like Carla said. So we can set the stage for this project in the context of current events. Just a couple weeks ago on Valentine's Day, the Maine Department of Marine Resources released their annual landings report and shared that last year's lobster fishing season was the most valuable ever, raking in nearly $725 million. And this is, of course, big news, as you can see from all these headlines. And this remarkably high value positions lobster to be the most valuable fishery in the country. And it is, of course, very welcome news for lobstermen and coastal communities across the state of Maine. But there's a couple other headlines reporting on the industry's record-breaking values in 2021 that also point out that the fishery is facing really serious challenges, has been facing serious challenges in the last year. The price that lobstermen are able to get for their catch was at an all-time high, but operational expenses were also up, including prices for things like traps, supplies, fuels, and especially bait, which has been increasingly difficult to source in recent years. Lobstermen have also expressed having trouble finding and retaining sternmen to work on their boats and process their catch. And of course, the industry has been facing increasing competition for space in the ocean, which may potentially result in significant regulatory changes that could present additional hurdles to lobstermen and associated industries. And right now, landings and value that are recorded and presented each year are the primary metrics that are used to understand the status of the fishery, leading to this sort of assumption that if catch and price go up, then things are good in the industry. If catch and price go down, things are not so good. And following this logic, then 2021 was an extremely good year for the fishery. In fact, the best one ever. But as we just touched on, the catch and the value data may not fully capture the serious challenges that the fishery is facing. And that fact sort of highlights the need for additional socioeconomic metrics that we can use to measure the status of the industry as a whole, including some of these challenges that are on the horizon. And so the Maine Lobstermen's Association brought this need to our project team, and we developed a research project that aims to identify socioeconomic indicators of resilience in order to add context to the catch and value indicators that are currently used to understand how the fishery is doing. Our process begins with interviewing the industry and the information that they use to evaluate the status of the fishery. And next, we will take what we heard and work to pin their words to quantifiable data. So to do this, we're trying to look beyond the types of data that are traditionally used to describe fisheries, like characteristics of the biological stock or the market, and towards other existing data that is already being collected that may describe something about the socioeconomic status of the fishery participants or coastal communities. And as we're searching for existing data, we're especially interested in information that's collected at fine, spatial, and temporal scales. because while census data, for example, can be very informative, because it's only collected once a decade, it doesn't quite match up with the timescale of decision-making that's relevant for fisheries and for the lobster fishery. And so we're specifically going to be searching for information that's collected more frequently and at fine scale spatial resolution as possible. And when the data collection and candidate indicator development process is complete, our next step is to take our findings back to industry to learn how well the indicators reflect the industry's perspective and provide a platform for improving them so that they are as relevant to the industry as possible. And in fact, our entire process has been designed to garner regular input to improve our methods and source new data, because underlying our research is a really active collaborative research community that includes many individuals from our partner institutions, local government officials, industry professionals, and anybody else that's interested in the work that we're learning, anyone else that's interested in learning more about the work that we're doing or contributing any feedback. And you all are now included in that process, because this is part of that, is presenting sort of our work in progress and gathering feedback and ideas about what we have found so far. And so now zooming into our industry interviews, that first step, that first blue box there, beginning here was really important, because rather than assume what the indicators may be, we wanted to directly ask those involved in the fishery. And that said, there's a history of research on social indicators that our team was able to draw from as a starting point. So we structured the interviews to ask about particular things identified from the literature or from our collaborative research community, and also provided opportunity for open-ended discussion to learn more about how industry members evaluate the status of the fishery and make sure that we had room to include things that might be missing from the literature. So from 38 interviews we conducted along the coast of Maine, we identified more than 100 metrics that different individuals use to evaluate the status of the fishery. We prioritized exploring metrics that are often identified as important or seen as important by many different people. And then we went through and sort of systematically grouped these metrics together into 8 candidate indicators. And before I share them, I just want to make a note pretty clear, which is that these are the candidate indicators we are working with right now, but the process is really ongoing. So the exact composition of these indicators is likely to change as we continue to get new information from our interviews and we source new data sets. So that's why this sort of presentation is exciting and why our collaborative research community has so much say into how things move forward from here. But at this point, these are the 8 candidate indicators that we've developed. You'll notice that each one is comprised of several different types of data, because they can't all necessarily be captured with a single metric. And for each type of data that describes the indicator, we had to find out if and where that data is being collected. And like I mentioned before, we're really interested in recording the spatial and temporal scale, because in some cases you can find a certain type of data in more than one place, but we're going to go for the one that has the finest spatial and temporal scale. And this is where we're able to identify and track down information on things that are not traditionally connected to the lobster fishery, but that our interviews tell us are relevant. And now we're going to zoom into the coastal accessibility candidate indicator that was number 1 on that list, and provide an example of how we're pinning existing quantitative data sets that are collected at fine scales to the information we get from the interviews. And this little graph here shows one of our interview questions. Our interview included a question that said, are property values an indicator of how the fishery is doing? And this box plot here shows that most people's answers clustered towards the affirmative, towards strongly agree. And based on that response, we started looking for data on property values. And we were able to find the finest spatial and temporal scale from realtor.com. And in order to make property values sort of relevant to coastal accessibility, we're also curious about the availability of properties. And so from realtor.com, we were able to generate this first look at the data, which basically shows that across the state of Maine, this is a pattern that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The line shows an increase in the average listing price of properties going up over the last 5 years. And the bars behind it show the total number of listings declining over that same time period. And while this is informative, we're also interested in sort of the average or the annual change in these values can also tell us a little bit of something about property values and coastal accessibility. And we can look at annual change on a figure like this. This is a quadrant plot, and on the horizontal axis, we have the annual change in listing price. On the vertical axis, we have the annual change in listing count. The top left quadrant indicates a situation where there's positive annual growth in listing count, so more listings, and negative annual growth in listing price, meaning it's lower prices. And so you can imagine that that is a positive for coastal accessibility. And in the red quadrant, you see the opposite: less listings, a higher price, and therefore less coastal access. And so when we look at the statewide data that I presented in a different format earlier, we can see how all of the last 5 years have seen reduced access to both properties, number of properties, and the price of properties has been increasing. And really quickly, I'm just going to zoom in on this little section and sort of show you this in a different way, see the details more clearly. And the reason for that is because I'd like to show you this comparison between what is happening at the state level and then use the fine scale spatial sensitivity of this data set to show you a couple other categories of data. So just below the state level, you can see this trend isolated to coastal towns. Below that, you see the data isolated to important fishing towns, which we defined as those that are in the top 25% of landings over the last 5 years. And finally, on the very bottom panel, this is the trend for property values and availability in Stonington, which is on a completely different and much more dramatic trajectory, as you can see. And so these data are clearly very impactful. They, provide a lot of insight into how the coastal accessibility in a given place is changing over time. And importantly, it also really validates what we heard from our industry interviews. We were told that property values are an important component of evaluating how the fishery is doing. And this analysis now allows us to incorporate it into the development of candidate indicators. And these data also illustrate a point we made earlier about the importance of spatial scale of the data sources we find, because it allows us to ask questions about how certain indicators may impact different communities in different ways. And while this data paints a picture of how property values and availability have changed over time, it also speaks to the importance of layering multiple types of data to describe an indicator, because on its own, this doesn't tell us everything we need to know about coastal accessibility, but it's certainly an important piece. And we've been investigating a few other pieces as well. So in addition to the property values and accessibility, we have begun to analyze the composition of new property owners in coastal towns. That's the top right bar graph here. This basically uses property transfer tax information to compare somebody's permanent address to the address of a Maine property that they own. So we can tell where people are moving from into Maine. The maps on the bottom left come from some research of state fishing license data, which we were able to identify an inland migration of fishing license holders. And the bottom right is a figure that shows that the number of towns where licensed harvesters live is increasing. And this reflects a change in and a movement away from traditional fishing towns. And you'll notice that these data sources are available at the town level and are recorded at least annually, some more frequently. And in terms of this candidate indicator, the larger coastal accessibility, we're continuing to source and analyze data that contributes to understanding this complex dynamic. And these are sort of 4 major ways that so far we're starting to investigate and build out this candidate indicator. And that leads to our next steps. So we're following a similar procedure to compile the 7 other candidate indicators we shared with you at the beginning of the presentation, that are informed by our interviews and our collaborative research community. And we're also seeking out data that is already being collected at appropriate scales that applies to each one. And when we've described the candidate indicators to the best of our ability, we'll be taking them back out to the industry in order to get practical feedback and about how well they actually describe the industry's perspective and their experience. And then we can also learn about how they can be refined to maximize their relevance to the fishery and also their accuracy in describing the status of the fishery. And finally, a major goal of this project is to build monitoring capacity for the socioeconomic indicators we developed. And Carla alluded to this in her introduction. The lobster fishery here in Maine is one of the most extensively monitored in the world, with programs that track several of the stages of the life cycle that you see here. And Josh sometimes lovingly refers to this as the Cadillac of biological monitoring, which I agree with, and rightfully so, because it's so critical to the sustainability of the species to understand the status of the biology at several stages. And in the same way, our project has the goal of allowing for monitoring of the human side of the fishery in an equally extensive way, because those socioeconomic indicators are also critical, but for the resilience of lobstermen and coastal communities in Maine. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you signing on this snow day. Hope everybody's staying safe and warm. And I want to thank again the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries for having us. And I'd like to end with another invitation to join the collaborative research community that I keep mentioning. You're welcome to send me an email here, and you'll get invited to our monthly open meetings where we sort of describe the progress of this project and look for feedback. With that, I'm happy to take questions or move to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Theresa. I would first hand it off to Kathleen Billings for any response.
Thank you. That's pretty interesting data. And I do think it does mirror some of the things that, I am seeing in the office, as far as with the property changes. And the only thing is, I would like to say, I think it's migrating a lot faster than maybe what your data is reflecting. It's pretty interesting to see, with the data that you've had, where people are coming from to, purchase property here, but also too, it will reflect how hard it will be for anybody who is trying to be close to the fishing industry, and work here and serve it, going forward. And we're at a point now where, we're just not going to be able to even really compete with anything with real estate. And that's going to be a problem. It just really and truly is. And housing, and I'm not sure, just exactly, with the real estate boom that we're seeing and the huge increases in prices, how that's all going to fall out for us.
Thanks, Kathleen. I also wonder if, looking at the that migration, the inland migration, and kind of relating that, there's sort of a temporal thing, might be really interesting to see how those move together. That will be, because I think you're right. And I'd like to probe a little bit further with you. That's sort of when we see this signal, and when did it start? Like, did people move out of their Stonington homes and start moving inland years before we saw the sale and the prices of these houses? And I think an important thing to also keep in mind is how many fishermen actually owned these homes. Because I think it's quick to interpret these data too, that, oh, fishermen are sitting on landmine investments in Stonington, so they just have to wait out the real estate boom, and when they sell the house, they'll make a killing. So I think there's some big things to kind of keep in context with a lot of that.
Well, there is 2 or 3 layers to it, because there was, a point that when, the fishery started improving, after we had the historic low prices around 2006, the real estate went down with the housing, global housing crisis and stuff. And they were some of the first that were able to get back into the real estate market. But now with the migration to the Northeast to get away from the cities, now they're facing being priced out. I know that Linda Nelson and I had a conversation yesterday, and probably rank and file, if I went to the bank to ask them, well, if I can get pre-approved for a loan, how much can I get pre-approved for? And it isn't going to be anything that's on the current listings. So, that's whether I like it or not, I've joined those that can't afford to live on the island anymore. And I'm lucky that I've got what I got.
Yeah. Kathleen, Reardon, do you have a response to the presentation?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a process to try to understand what these indicators mean. I mean, there's definitely change, but how do you interpret that as tension for the fishery when things are changing within management of the fishery? How does that going to impact the people? Does it mean that less people will have access to fish? Maybe they will decide it's not worth it. And it makes business decisions. Everyone may be adapting and reacting in different ways, but starting to delve into these indicators, I think is really important for the state to try to better understand the consequences of potential future management decisions.
Anyone else, Josh or Joelle, care to comment?
I had a follow-up question for Kathleen Billings, actually. I was struck by your comment about the pace at which you're seeing change basically happening faster than what you sort of perceive in the data that we presented. And curious what sort of data sets you use and how do you judge pace in your own work on a daily basis? And wondering if there's other data sets we should be looking at.
Well, it's more, I'd have to say, the observances of, what we migrate through our own office for data and stuff, certainly because, our big revenue thing is, property taxes and who has that property, what it sells for. I mean, we get declarations from the county, every month with it. And, through the decades that I've worked for the town, I mean, I've seen good years and I've seen bad years with the cycles of it. But, the nuances of the price increase, I mean, just in these few years, what was a house that was like maybe 225 on the real estate thing, and we might see, that market price reflected on the declarations, could be up to 500,000, depending on where the property is and what, values it may have with somebody. So, I mean, I've never seen an increase like what we've seen with this pandemic. I mean, this is unusual. The other thing is too is, who is buying that property and what for? A lot of it is the rental market now, and developers calling, and asking, well, are you guys going to develop short-term or rental ordinances and stuff like that? And I mean, and that is correlating with some of the stuff that is coming out with the state saying that, there's a shift going on looking at Maine as a destination, and, you can make some serious money on the rental market now. And, that's displacing, not only fishermen being at the coast, but everybody else. And it's pushing us further towards that gentrification faster than I've ever seen it. And I don't want to ramble on and take up for everybody else, but that's just, how I, see it, the day-to-day stuff more than anything.
I think, Kathleen, that's a really good point about the pace and the speed. I mean, you've been town manager since when?
2007, and I did start as a clerk, sometime in the, 97, 98 in Stonington.
Okay, because I wanted to say just a couple of our comments that are coming in through the chat talk about these sort of gentrification or housing market trends having gone on for 20, 30 years and 40 years in some cases. And so I think it's important to note that this rapid change. It's one of the things we heard from a lot of folks in our interviews. I mean, I think in particular, one of the islands in Casco Bay said that they used to be, a fishing dependent community. And now with rental markets and people who are telecommuting, it's no longer a fishing dependent community, that the majority of people, year-round residents, are no longer fishermen. And so I think, and that all happened, like you said, if you interviewed me last year, I'd have a different answer for you, but this year it's this answer. Okay, does anyone else on the panel have a comment? I'll otherwise go to Q&As. No? Okay. So I'll just say Jim Fisher, the town manager from Deer Isle, he also puts in a plea that we consider attitudinal data in our indicators. And we are, and Josh, do you want to take that?
Go for it, Theresa. But I was going to say we are as well. So yeah, feel free to take it.
We are as well. And if you see the latest MLA landings article, we do talk about how we are asking fishermen whether or not, or other industry related people, whether they recommend the next generation getting involved. And there's enough of a negative attitude about the way they discouraged and discouraging the next generation in many cases of moving into the industry. But yes, that's great, Jim. We'll continue with a lot more of those attitudinal variables. So let's see, are we considering climate change factors like sea level rise and how they may affect indicators like coastal accessibility?
That's a great question, and definitely a really important dynamic that for sure is going to be impacting coastal accessibility in the future. It's not something that we've looked at yet. I'd be very happy to take your suggestions of where sort of the best types of fine scale, temporal and spatial scale data exist for that type of thing. But absolutely, as it relates to reducing coastal accessibility in the future, it will become relevant to our candidate indicator process.
Thanks. This is that question relating to how long this trend has been happening. We also have data on changes in distance fishermen are living from access to the waterfront. And have you checked the availability to working waterfront provided by easements? And so, Barbara, I would say that Theresa had put up a slide looking at the addresses of license holders. So every year a fisherman has to renew their license. And so that has their mailing address. And she showed that graph of the coast of Maine. It wasn't blown up very well, but you can see an inland migration from the distance of shore. We could easily measure that and put on the increased distance that fishermen are traveling to get to work in the morning.
Yeah, Carla, I would piggyback off of that. We're measuring right now two metrics that are interrelated. One is around sort of distance from primary port to where they live, and you can track that on an annual basis through time. And we are seeing what we're describing as an inland migration. And then there's this second one about sort of what we've talked about in the past is as a port shed. So where are harvesters going to fish? And what we're seeing is this sort of expanding port shed. So places like Stonington are, they have people fishing out of Stonington from more and more communities, suggesting that people are sort of moving away from those ports, but still having to come back to fish in those places. And so that has all kinds of implications that we could explore on this call, but we see that as related to this sort of broader issue of coastal access.
Do you want to touch on the easements as well?
Oh yeah, we are not currently looking at easements, but would be interested in better understanding how this person sees that being connected to the indicators, and that's probably something we could data we could find.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to speak to Barbara Lawrence's other point about sort of the longevity of these trends, and just mention that the reason we only showed the data to 2017 is because we were able to get it at the scales we were interested in from realtor.com over that time period. But I agree, and we've heard that from fishermen and from other industry professionals, that this is not necessarily a new trend. But in our work, we're hoping that it's a new way of looking at it. You know, it's a new way of like evaluating what does that real estate trend mean for the fishery, especially as, like Carla said in the beginning, the dependence on a single species fishery is becoming higher. And there's, you know, limited space. There's specific places where people need to live in order to access that occupation. So yeah, point taken, and appreciate you sharing your like historical understanding of that trend too.
And there's another question about, have we considered Deer Isle and Little Deer Isle in the data, and how might that change? I don't know, maybe that one trend for Stonington, if you did like a peninsula or an island-wide analysis. Do you know?
I don't know off the bat how it might change it, but we do ask during our interviews about how people define their communities. And we have a couple different levels that we can look at data at. So outside of the town level, we're also interested in sort of zone level trends, county, all the way up to the state. But for a lot of people, you know, they mentioned their community is more than one town. And we have some information about that. And in many cases, people in Stonington describe Deer Isle and Little Deer Isle as part of their community. So we can definitely be combining those types of towns that sort of operate as a group.
Okay, thanks. What else do we have here? So I don't want to skip over things. Scallop farming has gotten some really good press recently. Do you folks see this as a healthy diversification of the fishing industry, or just a one-off, or something with a minor impact?
I might turn that back to those of you who are either on the call or on this panel who are in Stonington to offer a perspective on that. Certainly, we've seen diversification of the fleet decline through time, but in terms of overall impact, I would look to you who are in the communities.
I guess that's me or Kathleen Billings. Kathleen's the one who sees most of the lease applications that would come in, but I think it's part of it, but it's nowhere near able to absorb what the loss would be from lobstering. It plays a small piece. There's various groups have efforts to teach fishermen, or retrain fishermen to get into aquaculture and to get into farming. And really the success of attracting fishermen to those programs has been pretty slim. So it's not, in the shorter term, it's probably not something that people are going to take on as a diversification strategy. It's probably something that maybe a younger generation, someone who's just coming in and is interested in having fishing be part of their portfolio, rather than fishermen shifting to being growers. That's just my sense of things. Kathleen, do you have either Kathleen really?
Yeah, I would. The other thing is the scallop farming. You have to put a lot of time into that, and to get your return of investment. And also too, I mean, I think you have to be really in tune with, when's the best time to do it, and take care of your scallops. The other thing is my sense is that finding appropriate lease areas, or where they would grow really well and stuff like that, seems to be, I guess up for debate, where that might go. And also too, like with scallops, I mean, they run in cycles too. I mean, some years you've got plenty of scallop spat around, and other years you may not. That's what happens when you depend on, natural resources and, whatever guides them going along with it. I will say that I think the ones who are, into the oyster farming seem to be doing a little bit better and stuff, and maybe because they make a little more money out of it. But, it is an interesting question, though.
Yeah, I kind of have a working hypothesis that almost any of the diversification strategies that require kind of a long learning or an investment of time or even money to educate and get a certification of some sort like that, those are probably not very viable diversification strategies for fishermen who are invested in fishing. It may be a diversification strategy for someone who's just coming into fishing and they haven't quite thrown all of their money at it yet. But I think a lot of the fishermen who that's what they know, that's what they do, they're going to just keep fishing, or they'll switch to something that they already did, whether they already have a plumber's certificate or whether they already have pounded nails and worked as carpenters. But I think the diversification strategy is going to be something that they could basically walk off the boat and walk into this other thing almost on the same day or the very next week. And that's just a working hypothesis. I think it would be a great one for us to move forward and test, but that's the sense I get from talking with a lot of fishermen. So we'll get back to the questions. Theresa, one factor, is kind of along those lines, Peter, probably is already included in the thinking is the aging of the fishing population. While there are hopeful signs of young people entering the industry, the shortage in stearnsmen already may exceed that prospect. It would seem to me that one huge factor to be considered is the retirement rate and generational prospect evident.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, were you finished?
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge signal for sure. Something we heard in a lot of our interviews and kind of relates to the attitudinal aspects too, in terms of how people are thinking about the status of the lobster fishery in the future, what their sort of outlook is on how it's going to be. And the age of the fleet definitely comes up. One of the indicators is sort of this changing community composition. And this is a big part of that. We can use licensing data, and we have already, to start analyzing what the age distribution is of different fisheries. And yeah, that you're spot on with exactly what we're seeing in that industry, and it will definitely be rolled into our indicators because it's a big component of how well the fishery is capable of doing. How many active lobster licenses are being used.
Thanks. Richard Nelson wants to make sure that we don't forget the sternmen, the dock workers, the boat and trap shop, the drivers, the folks who aren't necessarily trackable via fishing licenses. So and they often have fewer resources available to them for housing because of what their relative income is. Do we have a consideration of tracking them, or are we just including them because if fishermen can't afford to live on the coast, they probably can't either?
I can respond to that. That's a really tough, as you know, it's a really challenging population of people to collect data on, because there isn't a formal licensing process for sternmen and workers. Some of that is indirectly captured in things like this coastal accessibility indicator. In theory, that wouldn't just impact harvesters, it would impact sort of the general fishing industry at large. But we'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts on what specific data sets or ways we could get at crew, if you have any, for anyone on this call.
Yeah, it's tough. Crew are all 1099 data too, so it's not like it's trackable via census data or anything like that. Okay. Contact us if you have suggestions. So Jill from Nova Scotia says that we're having a phenomenon of people who had migrated out earlier and now coming back home due to the end of Western oil, the Western oil boom, and re-engaging with the fishery. Have we seen a similar phenomenon in Maine? Yeah. Do you want to expand, Josh, or no?
Oh, sorry. I was reading David Thomas's email and
Oh.
agreeing with what he was saying.
I'll just say yes, Jill. I would say here, I live in Deer Isle, near Stonington. I would definitely say there's quite a few people, even if they didn't migrate away to live, they migrated to another industry or another source of income and have come into fishing in the past definitely in the past 5 years. I think it probably started almost 10 years ago. But then those people, I'm seeing them bounce back as they're looking at the fishery regulations and things coming down the line. They're saying, oh, I still have this certificate, or I still have this ability to do this other job. Maybe I'll bounce back into this other thing. And for a lot of them, it's because they can't get enough crew to keep fishing viable, where that other industry that they participated in only requires them, and it doesn't require a helper. So that's one of the things we're seeing. But at the same time, we've also seen a lot of folks who grew up here leave and come home. One family bought a lobster dock off of his dad, and he and his sister are running it. And he went and worked out of state for a while and has come back to run that. We have some other folks who left and have come back to be oyster growers. I think it's just also a phenomenon that people went away and really missed coastal living, missed the being home and in a small town where you can still do a lot of stuff that you can't do other places. But that would be that. Jim Chesney, are you measuring fishing dependence by looking at indicators for the strength of alternative industries like ecotourism?
I would say that we're not necessarily looking for indicators that tell us about other industries exactly. In my mind, sort of all of the 8 candidate indicators and whichever other ones we develop sort of work together to tell us something about how the lobster fishing industry and the people who are a part of it are impacting the town, and sort of vice versa, how the community makeup and dynamics is impacting the lobster fishery. So I would say I think that's probably the focus of our work, but inherently a place that has a stronger ecotourism sector may have different patterns. And I think that's something that we can take into account for sure. So hopefully that answers your question.
And have we compared results to the Nymphs community social indicators?
Yeah, I saw 2 questions from Rachel Feeney. So the Nymphs community social indicators were actually sort of the basis for this work. They are sort of exist at a national scale, and they use census data. And so we sort of started from there. They were really useful for developing our interview guide. And we're trying to take those indicators and make them more specific to the lobster fishery in Maine, sort of specifically. So yeah, definitely, that's a really great resource. And there's tons of good information on the NIMF site around the social indicators. And then I saw you also asked about if there's a report available with these 8 indicators, the answer to which is not yet. When they're more complete and validated by industry is when we'll put them out to the public. Keep an eye out. We'll definitely let the community know.
And I would just piggyback off of that. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for being on the call. In response to the social indicator stuff, Lisa Colburn, who's one of the key people involved in developing those, is an advisor on this work and has been engaging with us since the very beginning. And it's been really useful to have her perspective and her insights into this work that we're doing. And I think at some point when we are at a place where this set of indicators is finalized, doing some type of formal analysis, looking at how the work that they've done compares to what we find, I think would be really interesting and speak to the sort of these are national level data sets versus more locally relevant. So I look forward to that when we get to that point. Thanks for that question.
And I'm not going to read the ongoing commentary between access and all of that, but if anybody's interested, there's a lot of experienced folks talking about the different negotiations and the way they're protecting shore access for the fishing industry. Kathleen Reardon, I think I've seen your hand up for a while. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to that question from Nova Scotia, the kind of anecdotal observation that people are coming back after going to a boom, like oil boom in the western provinces of Canada. I actually would answer that differently, because I don't think that fishermen or people that are from these coastal communities, if they do not have a license, they don't have the ability to come back. I think that is actually similar to Canada. So it is something that it would be difficult to find in the data. I think that what Carla was talking about is more people are coming back because there are jobs. There are jobs working on boats as crew, but it's not typically as captains. If people live in another state, they actually likely have to give up their lobster license. And so I don't think that we would have data. It may be anecdotal that some people are coming back, but I think it's kind of similar to the crew question of trying to understand the dynamics among the infrastructure and all of the people that work within the industry that are not licensed. That would be a hard question to tackle with data.
Yeah, and I would just add that the incidence of folks who left and came back, or even lived here, didn't leave but left to work somewhere else, maintained their lobster license the whole time they were away, was something that they had gained at a young age and kept it up while they went away to college or did whatever else. So that allowed them to have that option. Let me see. I work with businesses that are based in Hancock County from the Department of Labor. This information is definitely important to consider, and I would definitely like to hear more information on the market affecting this industry. If you can provide more insight on this topic. One question that I wanted to ask was, how do you see the lobster industry being affected by potential upcoming regulations that may be brought upon by the administration, as well as adapting to changes in those regulations by future administrations? The loaded question.
Yeah, I can answer that. I think you know, our project doesn't try to link specifically these indicators to specific threats, right? So we're not trying to find an indicator that will tell us what is the effect of a specific regulation on the lobster fishery. It's more that we want to be able to find a way to measure how the lobster fishery is doing at a given time. And so, you know, by measuring and monitoring these candidate indicators, we can say, and then when we perceive a positive or negative change, we know, okay, something's going really well here, or something is sort of problematic here. And this kind of answers the question that was in the Q&A box as well. That's sort of the goal of this work, rather than trying to model out how a specific regulation is going to influence a specific component of the fishery. In terms of adapting to those changes, I think the sort of the same answer applies. Like, we're just really trying to figure out a way to monitor when change does happen in the industry by any sort of threat or change in the regulations. So hopefully that answers your question. We're not looking directly at that, but we do think that our research can be useful in order to try to maintain the resilience of the fishery in the face of all sorts of challenges.
Thanks. Then are there data, and I was trying to think of an example, are there data from other towns that have had perhaps more success in diversifying their economies to include aquaculture and other non-fishing things that have shown, success in stabilizing their marine economic and employment diversity? Do we have those for which to provide a basis of comparison, or to see how that indicator works differently?
We are doing this work at across the state, right? So it's not just in Stonington. Theresa shared some data from Stonington as an illustrative case, since we're presenting through MCCF, but we certainly could look at different communities in different places. Apologies for the background fans. Yeah, we could absolutely compare between different communities, and that is something we could, questions like that, how does diversification impact responses and sort of general resilience in the fishery, or something that we could probe down the line, and we'd love to engage with you on that if you have specific ideas.
And then how many of our interviews happen to mention the shift to ropeless being a factor affecting their resilience?
We heard in our interviews all sorts of mention of regulation change over time, and the fact that that obviously has an impact on, the industry's ability to sort of maintain the catch and the price that they need to maintain their business. And so ropeless gear specifically came up now and then, because of course it's sort of top of mind as it's being presented as a new option. So I don't have an exact number for you, but it's definitely on people's mind, just like all regulatory changes are.
And then looks like one of our last questions is, how about conducting focus groups? Would focus groups be able to be a way to get information about crew?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Focus groups is sort of our plan for the validation component of these indicators. So when they're all more fully flushed out, that's sort of how we would like to bring them back to the industry and get feedback. And definitely incorporating sternmen and dock workers and other types of support staff, I think, will be a crucial piece. And you're right, maybe that is how we can sort of get their reactions to the data that we've collected and understand where that does or doesn't match up with their experience as compared to how it might match up to captains.
Yeah, and I just I see two hands. I'll just follow up on that and go back to Kathleen. The other thing, Barbara, is that we're hoping to have this be kind of annually, maybe automated or by 2 years, every 3 years, so that the focus groups would be hoping to find data sets that reflect what's happening with crew, as opposed to being able to conduct a focus group every year to get an idea of what's happening with crew. So that's one of the things too that we want to be able to, but it's not necessarily a challenge, but it's a thing that we're trying to achieve, so that these are data that can be constantly tapped and used in determining management or other sorts of decisions. So Kathleen, Billings.
Yeah, just to follow up with the person that had the question about the diversifying the economy. I have, spent some significant time trying to figure out with, some of the with the social indicators and of course the threats has come, is there something more we can do to position ourselves, especially here for our island economy? And strangely enough, I mean, there's not anything that you seem like you could be able to get to, diversify or look at perhaps, what might be the lobster industry changing to or as a result of to do it. It's almost like you have to be a mill town that crashes and burns before you can get any EDA money or anything. So, which is such a strange thing to me when you can see something on the horizon coming, but you're on your own basically to either create positions or try to find funding if there was something that might match it, but there just really doesn't seem to be any type of either grant funding to be able to undertake that process, strangely enough. So, I have been talking a little bit with the governor's innovation office with Hannah, but, it's a strange It's a strange thing, and not to be able to be proactive, in facing that, curiously enough.
Thanks, Kathleen. And I'll leave Kathleen Reardon to the final comment.
Well, you kind of already said what I had raised my hand up for, talking about how focus groups can be used to validate these data sets, but the intent is not just to do a snapshot. That often social indicators are talked about. We're trying to find the data sets so that it can be incorporated. It can be a continuous data collection or data kind of product that can be provided to managers so that it can be incorporated into management processes and decisions, whether it's at the municipal level or at the state level or the federal level. Having those data sets for monitoring over time is really important to be able to consider them, because we don't want to say that data is old, we aren't sure if that's really true anymore. So it is this, that's the exciting thing about this project, and challenge, as Carla, I think, said, trying to find data sets that can be utilized for the future.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our panelists. And Paul, am I handing off to you to close everything out, or? There we are.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Nice job. Thanks to the panelists for joining us today. I really enjoyed that. That's a lot of information. I look forward to hearing more about the other indicators too. And thanks for the attendees. I'll just point out something that, in our world in fisheries science, at writ large, we often look at natural system, biological systems, and the challenges that are going on around us in an ecological kind of ecosystem way. And we lean on that and technology towards seeking solutions and refining problems. And I just really applaud Carla's work with this team here, looking at the social economic side of these questions, because they are really are very, very important. And I think the maturation of social ecologic systems approaches to these kinds of problems is exactly what the planet needs. And I'm so pleased that you could join us for this today, and that MCCF can be part of this important work. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.